Ready to go? Okay, good evening, everybody. And first of all, happy St. Patrick's Day. Second, do we have any guests tonight? No. You do need the microphone. All right. I got. We have one over here. Thank you, Ross. Thank you for your input, Ross.
Yes, I have a guest, my significant other and my wife, Mary Beth.
Yes,
Okay.
good to be here.
Welcome. And I guess I'm the only other one that has a guest. It's my wife, Brenda. This is her second time here this year. Last time was February 17th, and it was our 53rd wedding anniversary. Tonight is the 54th anniversary of the day we met on St. Patrick's Day, 67. And she said if I told you about the circumstances of how we met, there would not be a 55th. Third thing I want is, we've set up a new schedule to finish this season. In April, it's going to be Dr. Mike Cagney, and he's going to talk about the universe, and he's going to give us 3 examples. Okay. So in May, in May, my friend Sam Field will talk about solar energy, solar power. He and his son have a company that actually puts together solar panels. And we're going to skip the month of June as Barbara Walters can't make it that month. So we will have a meeting in July when she will give her talk on pre-colonial Africa. And fourth, we normally have our elections for new board members, etc., in April. But with all the things that have been going on, we have to put that off until May. I know you're all anxious to vote, okay? And fifth, on behalf of Joe Fugate, a reminder that dues are still due. So if you haven't paid up yet, cough it up, okay? So now to our program about the evil English penal laws. I'm part Anglo-Irish, 25%, and those were the English who invaded Ireland and stole 80% of the land from the locals. So I'm on both sides of this issue. But I will say, without fear of contradiction, that what the Nazis were to the Jews, the English were to the Irish. For an example, 50 years before the penal laws that Dave's going to talk about, there was a guy named Oliver Cromwell, and he invaded Ireland. The armies clashed, and about 28,000 soldiers on each side, or altogether, died. But according to contemporary accounts, between 200 and 600,000 civilians died from war-related violence. In addition to that, 50,000 Irish were captured and sent to the colonies as indentured servants, otherwise known as slaves. And thus began the rightful hatred of the English by Irish Catholics. But then came the penal laws to add even greater pain. So now to our speaker tonight in this program. Dave McMorrow graduated from Notre Dame in '67, Wayne State Law School in '70, right? Mm-hmm. He worked for a major New York law firm for 4 years, where according to him, he learned how sausage is made, okay? I worked in one of those slaughterhouses myself, so I know exactly what he meant, okay? Then he spent 3 years as a U.S. attorney in Brooklyn, and he spent a lot of time in the Eastern District Federal Court. Dave then came back to Kalamazoo, practiced law with his brother, and then with our friend Jim Ford, right?
No, I was with Dick Enslin for a while, and then I ultimately joined up with Ford and Creek.
Yeah, well, Jim Ford. I said then.
That's not Jim Ford.
I'm sorry.
That's the old Henry Ford.
Oh, okay, all right. But then he got religion and left the law and became a partner in a company that manufactured small plastic molding products. They started with 3 employees, and when he was bought out 20 years later, there were 90 employees working, 25 presses, 3 shifts a day. Were you a slave driver?
Well, I was a beneficiary of it. My partners were the slave drivers.
Right.
They're Dutch.
So finally, outside the law and the business world, Dave is the original board member of that great nonprofit outfit, Tillers International. So everybody, please welcome Dave McMorrow.
Well, thank you, Jeff. Yeah, I am. I'm all set. As to Oliver Cromwell, I think that it's hard to keep track of populations, but I think it is between 400,000 and 600,000 Irish just disappeared. So it was quite devastating. Of course, if you talk to Prince Charles, he thinks that Oliver Cromwell is the greatest Englishman that ever lived. So, yeah. So tonight I'm going to talk about the Irish penal laws, and I know you're going to have a lot of questions as we go along, and I'm going to try and there are volumes written about this. You're going to have a lot of questions. I'll try and get through it quickly so that we can get to those. Jeff told me when I first volunteered to take this on because I was interested in it, that I ought to just jump right into the penal laws, but I don't think we can do that without having some background. So let me run through. This is really just a thumbnail, history, if I can. Now, since 1182, when the English crown under Henry II was invited into Ireland by, I hate to say it, by Dermot McMorrow, and the English had been coveting the land. He took one look at it after Strongbow had been over there for a while, and he said, this is a mighty nice place. I think I'd like to get some of this land to my friends. And last year, where our family gathered in Portsmouth, and I happened to buy a bunch of hats from an Irishman who was a vendor at a store in their beautiful store. And I gave him my credit card, and he looked up at me, and he said, "Spawn of Dermot, no doubt." So every English schoolboy knows Dermot McMorrow. The next year, his son came back and did win a big battle, but this is really worthy of a topic someday because it's a great story. Dermot got in a big fight with another Irish king. It was over a woman. Okay, yes, yeah, exactly. He basically kidnapped the wife of O'Connell, a neighboring kingdom, but she was about 4 years older, the original cougar, and apparently she was just some woman, but she hated her husband, so what she did is this was a contrived kidnapping, and it was a laugh of all continental Europe. Everybody knew about it, and so the cuckolded husband went after Dermot, and it went back and forth anyway. So, but since that time, that's really when the English started to exercise some control. And colonists were sent to Ireland, but they kept getting absorbed into the population. Ireland is a very mongrel population. They talk about themselves as being all Celts. That's nonsense. I have friends who are Scandinavian who celebrate St. Patrick's Day, and the theory that there's more Scandinavian blood in Ireland than there is Celtic. It's a coastal country. All coastal countries have huge input of bloods from other people that are coming around. Very big Scandinavian. Irish fought them for years, and they sent to hell with it when they started marrying them. That's basically what happened. So you had Vikings, of course. They were notorious because they would raid Ireland for the women. Before they went on one of their cruises, they'd stop their ships and they'd get as many women as they can. And word always was that the worst thing that could ever happen to a Viking ship is to get in be blown off course and to have a solitary ship washed up on the Irish coast, because then they get their vengeance. So then you have the Norman invasions, the Danish invasion. The Danes, Dublin is a Danish word. They were prominent. And then there are all these people that were living in Ireland to work different trades. There's a colony of 30,000 Flemish. I think of Fleming as being an Irish word, a name. But apparently it comes from this Flemish colony. And that's not even, like I say, the sailors who washed up on the shore from the Spanish Armada are probably the smallest group. In any event, it didn't work out well for the kings of England, because they would always go native. They'd end up being absorbed into the Irish community. So, and I say this just to point out that all these people that poured into Ireland ultimately were Catholic, and they were just absorbed into this Irish Catholic society. Then along comes Henry VIII, the Protestant Reformation, the requirement that all the peoples that ultimately made its way to Ireland, when all peoples under the control of the Church of England and then the Church of Ireland were expected to adopt the state religion. And of course, the Irish, especially what we call the Irish Gaelic community, the absorbed community, refused to do so. So from that point on, they're bringing in this religious distinction. So there are several dominant themes that pop up during the late 1500s and the 1600s, working up to the penal laws. First of all, we started seeing large-scale transplantation of Protestant English and Scots farmers into Irish land. We see Irish basically backing the losing side in the English Civil War, which went back and forth, as you may recall. I won't get into the details. Finally, as Jeff mentioned, we have the Cromwell invaded Ireland and seized a lot of land and distributed it to his troops. And his troops, they were a thuggish crowd. They were a lot of soldiers who were picked up off the streets of England. And they became property owners and overseers to Irish Catholics. And apparently, they left a bad taste in the mouth of everybody. And finally, we end up, the Irish were backing the losing side in the Battle of the Boyne River in Ireland in 1690. And as a result of the Battle of the Boyne, excuse me one second here. As a result of the Battle of the Boyne, the Irish reached an agreement whereby they would be allowed to maintain control and ownership of their land and have freedom of their religion. In exchange for that, they laid down their arms. Well, that was the agreement, negotiated on the battlefield. But it was then brought to the Parliament of Ireland, which was all Protestant. And they said, to hell with that. We're not agreeing to that. We have these Irish Catholics down. We have their weapons. In fact, the soldiers had already been shipped off to the continent. The Irish soldiers that were lost in the Battle of the Boyne were shipped to fight in the Continental Wars, and they became known as the Wild Geese. There were only about 15 or 20,000 of them after the Battle of the Boyne. Over the next 150 years, there were, they figure, between 300,000 and 400,000 Irish men, boys, young people, fled Ireland and went to fight in the Continental armies. In any event, enter the penal laws. They were negotiated, shouldn't say negotiated, and enacted. They were brutally repressive acts that were intended to be applied to Irish Catholics explicitly. And the purpose of them was to take the Irish community and make it an impoverished, miserable group of people, uneducated, bereft of their culture, bereft of their religion, and alive and functioning to do nothing else but support and farm the land of the English landowners, most of whom were actually in England, large-scale landowners, and then smaller-scale landowners in England. And the English-owned land, the big property owners had overseers. and estate managers, and they would control the operation of the property. So the all-Protestant Parliament of Ireland started these very complex penal laws. I'm just going to give you the title of them. For every title of these, there probably are 10, 15, or 20 sub-laws, to get into every aspect of Irish culture and human relations. Catholic bishops were given a deadline to leave Ireland and to return under penalty of death and to be drawn and quartered if they came back. They were given, just a couple of years to get out completely and don't come back. Catholic priests were initially banished and outlawed. It never worked. It didn't work. These laws were loosened up about 30 years later because Catholic priests continued to service the community. They had an underground network of them. It was quite elaborate. They wore peasant clothes or clothes of minstrels, bagpipers, whatever it may be. They were hidden from home to home, and they were able to survive. Catholic worship was forbidden, though Catholics were still required to pay tithes to the Church of Ireland. Well, that didn't work either. I mean, it was deeply suppressed, but Mass was still said. It was oftentimes said at special rocks, sometimes called Mass rocks. Occasionally they were caught. The priests were beaten up, rarely killed, but they were beaten up badly, and sometimes they were splattered with blood. And they kept that for a long time because it was a symbol of the repression. And a lot of people who were caught were questioned, and they wanted to know who was present at these masses. So in many cases, they put up linen curtains so that they could not identify who the priests were behind the curtain, because the whole idea of swearing, of lying under oath, was verboten. They would not do that. So, kind of Jesuitical ways of doing it. So, Catholics could not marry Protestants. Under no way, shape, or form could that be done, and it must have been very frustrating because the only way they could marry Protestants, or the Protestants could get at the Catholic women, was to get those women to abrogate their Catholic faith, which I suspect many did. Catholics could not own, manufacture, or carry weapons of any kind. Catholics, the Irish, curiously enough, had a history of being very good metalsmiths. That was a trade or skill which they had acquired through the years. I don't know how effective they were. I just read stories of people who did manage to manufacture their own pistols. Catholics were forbidden to own or operate or use schools and were prohibited from acting as teachers or schoolmasters. Again, teachers and schoolmasters were moved from house to house secretly. Rudimentary education was carried on under what are called hedges or hedge schools. So they were deep hedges, like the ones they had in Normandy. And they would actually write instruction in the dirt on the hedges, and there'd be 10 or 15 kids there observing and participating. It was rudimentary, but they were keeping alive basic skills. Catholics were actually forbidden to educate their own children. They were forbidden to employ Catholic teachers, and they were also forbidden to send their children abroad to be educated. They were forbidden to import a teacher from abroad, although many did come, and again were hidden, but they were prohibited. The idea was to keep them ignorant, really ignorant. They were prohibited from exercising trade with Protestants. They were prohibited from living, actually, not only within a corporate town, but living within 5 miles of a corporate town. They could not own a horse worth more than 5 pounds. Now, that may sound petty, but the Irish have always had a favored relationship with horses. I mean, to this day, it's very heavily Irish trainers that are found down in Kentucky, with a high-end stables. And it also has an interesting story because Irish had their own nobility, kings of various sections of the country. And the last Prince of Ireland was shot and killed. I think he had actually been abroad, and he was home, and he had a beautiful horse. And he was confronted, probably by one of Cromwell's people. But the Protestant said, "I want your horse, and I'm going to give you £5." And he said, "You can't have it." He pulled out a gun and shot and killed him. And he gave us £5 for his widow. So Catholics were forbidden to hold a life annuity. They could not vote or hold a public office. Any public office required that they take an oath, and I mean an oath. This is an oath that just takes your breath away. I went back and researched it, and it's you have to take an oath not only of allegiance to the king, but you have to take a declaration against the Catholic faith and against the concept of transubstantiation. Oh, and the word Catholic was never used until about 1700s. It was always popery. Papists were believers in popery. The word Catholic, in fact, it was kind of a scandal when the word Catholic was first used at the end of the 17th century. The Catholic was forbidden from serving as guardian of his own children or providing a guardianship of a child. If he was facing death, he didn't have the authority to provide, when he was gone, a guardian of a child. A very big prohibition. Catholics were not allowed to enter the legal profession or to work in any capacity, even in a legal office. And there were a lot of Catholic barristers and solicitors. And many of them chose to accept the state religion and to go through this, burdensome process of, proving that you are a bona fide convert to the state religion. They had too much at stake, just like, and the same as serving as a commission in the army, as an officer in the Army or the Navy, because you again would have to take an oath. I think in the early years you couldn't even serve in the Army or Navy in any capacity, as they needed bodies later on in the century. That was ameliorated, but until the Catholic Disabilities Acts were passed, the relief of Catholic Disabilities Acts were passed later in the 1600s, they could not serve as an officer in the Army. Now, I'm convinced, and I think many commentators are, that the whole purpose of the penal laws was to really get at the land that was still owned by the Catholics. And I apologize because this is my first experience with PowerPoint. And I have a slide that got mixed around. But let me make this point. At the beginning of the 1600s, Irish Catholics owned, it's unclear, anywhere from 70 to 95% of their own land. But we do know that by the end of the 1600s, at the enactment of the penal laws, Irish Catholics owned approximately 14% of the land. And about 5% of that land was in the West, and it was marginally productive. Now, and that was at the point at which after the Battle of Boyne, it was called the Treaty of Limerick, was negotiated. So there's just an unfathomable degree of venality and rapaciousness with these English property owners. It was almost as if they were sitting at a club in London and comparing how much land they owned in Ireland, because they were hell-bent on getting as much of that remaining 14% of that land as they could. So there were these very prohibitive laws pertaining to real estate. Catholics were forbidden to lease, inherit, or receive a gift of land from Protestants. They were forbidden to rent any land worth more than 30 shillings a year or reap from their land any profit exceeding a third of the rent. In fact, if they did that and they were challenged by a Protestant and they were found to have been exceeding that formula, they could forfeit the land to the Protestant who challenged him. They were hell-bent on getting the rest of that land. As I say there, the penalty for violating any of the laws was forfeiture of the Catholic's land. That also held true for some of the other prohibitions. For example, if you were found to have a weapon, or if you were suspected of having a weapon, you're a Catholic, and a Protestant somehow or other picked up that you had a weapon, the magistrate for the community, without any warrant of any kind, could go just on the basis of that allegation and go into your home. And if they found a weapon, it would result in the seizure of your land and all of your property. So the point is that by the 1800s, the percentage of arable Catholic land in Ireland had gone down to, from 14% in 1700 to 5%. These penal laws resulted in their getting the other 9%. And it's a terrible price to be paid for that 9%. So in sum, over the course of 200 years, the percentage of, probably 250 years, the percentage of Irish land owned by Catholics declined from approximately 90% to no more than 5%. And most of that was stone-ridden and less productive over in the western counties of Clare, Mayo, Galway, Sligo, where there was a lot of stone. Pretty country, but it's tough to farm. The companion purposes of the penal laws. The goal was to disassociate the Irish Catholics from the soil, because obviously they had thousands of years of association with the land and their desire to own their own land. That was not successful because it drove them to acts of rebellion throughout the 16 and the 1700s and even the 1800s, and ultimately the creation of the Irish Free State in 1920. If the goal of the penal laws was to reduce the Irish to a state of unimaginable poverty, it was very successful. By 1700s, it was indisputably the poorest subclass in Europe. Edward Burke, the great political philosopher, himself an Anglican, but his father belonged to the Church of England. His mother, though, was Irish Catholic. And so he was raised Protestant, but he had a sister who was raised Catholic. So he had kind of a peculiar sensitivity to what was going on. He described the penal laws as a machine of wise and elaborate contrivance for the oppression, impoverishment, and degradation of a people. Bear with me a second, and I had everything neatly laid out here, but I had a couple of other quotes of the time. I know that that several of the philosophers of the Enlightenment were kind of stunned from their trips to Ireland at the sheer final degradation of the property, as were. Yes, thank you. Yeah. Samuel Johnson wrote that there is no instance, even in the 10 persecutions, that is the 10 persecutions of the early Christian church, of such severity as that which the Protestants in Ireland exercised against the Catholic. And the French jurist Montesquieu wrote that the penal laws were, quote, contrived by demons, written in blood, and registered in hell. Just to point out just the almost intrinsic evil of some of the laws, let me give you an example. If the wife of an Irish Catholic was unfaithful and then went through the formalities of converting to the state religion, she could legally extract a burdensome annuity from her cuckolded husband and would be entitled to inherit his property at his death, to the exclusion of his wife, his faithful wife if he remarried, but certainly to the exclusion of his children. In the same way, if an Irish Catholic had a bastard child, that child could convert to the state religion, or actually if that child was raised in the state religion, had been adopted and raised in the state religion, that child could compel an annuity from the Irish Catholic father, and in addition would be entitled to inherit his land to the exclusion of his wife and his children. Now, I was talking about the severity of the laws aimed at ownership of the land. And the most severe, and I must, in the process of preparing this, I had so much information, I had some assistance from somebody in pulling out what this person thought, retired professor from Western, who was very helpful to me, and she helped me produce this. And I didn't make the point of saying that what is most devastating of the penal laws pertaining to the seizure of land or the desire to get at that land was the fact that Catholics were forbidden to follow the law of the practice of primogeniture. In other words, the practice whereby the oldest child inherits the farm. Law specifically said that when an Irish Catholic died, their farm, their land, had to be divided into as many children as that person had. So, let me give you an example. If you had a 50-acre farm, say, to make it easier, a 100-acre farm, and instead of leaving that 100-acre farm to one child and let the rest, move on and fend for themselves and find some niche and buy their own farm or whatever, as is often the case in our country, but just a matter of practice. That Catholic, his estate was required to be divided. If he had 10 children, it would be divided into 10 parcels of 10 acres each and distributed among his children. You do that, some of these big families, and a lot of kids, you do that within 1 or 2 generations. You've basically denigrated these land holdings into unsustainable small parcels. The taxes alone and challenges to that land, burdens on that land, would make it worthless, or easily seized. So the practice against forbidding the practice of primogeniture was just deadly. And that, I believe, more than anything else, was responsible for their success in getting that other 9% of the land, lousy 9%. So, but I think in many respects, the penal laws were not a success. Yes, they did drive the people into a state of unimaginable misery and poverty, and they did forfeit a lot of their land. But amazingly, they remained very stubbornly loyal to their faith. There were some professionals and big landowners who moved for the sake of obvious self-interest to the Church of England, or in this case, the Church of Ireland. But the Catholics devised clever and ways of working around these prohibitions on the following of their religion. Within about 30 years, the Protestants of Ireland, realized that they were not succeeding in driving out the Catholic faith. They saw what was happening. And so probably by about 1730, 1735, they gradually came to the realization that this isn't working. And what we probably should better cooperate. What we'll do is we will tolerate. They'll have a seminary, and we will tolerate the presence of, say, one priest per parish, and control their moving around. And in return for that, they received a commitment. I don't know how this was negotiated, but they did this as they got commitments from the various priest, probably from Rome or representatives, that they would respect the private property rights, and they would not, at least the Catholic Church itself, would not challenge the authority of the state. Well, I'm sure that didn't set well with many of the Catholics, because in fact throughout the 1700s and even into the 1800s, there were land leagues, that is uprisings against their repression and against their loss of land. And they were tenants, and they had burdensome rents to pay. And so there were periodic uprisings and attacks on the officers of the state, and it was a very volatile situation. And to a certain extent, there was tension between many of the priests and the actual parishioners, who they wanted their land back, and they were never going to be satisfied with this arrangement. Throughout this, looking at these penal laws, they are enormous in their just in the sheer numbers of them, and the way they worked like sinews into the body politic, and how they controlled what people could do and couldn't do. I kind of kept asking myself, they were so extreme and kind of so seemingly contrary to what you might consider the most basic Christian values and human decency. How could they happen? Well, considerations at rock bottom, basically underlied such barbaric laws. Those historians who bother to, ask that question, and I noticed a lot of personal biases, let me tell you. But they do suggest several answers. One, the Anglo-Irish, but especially the absentee English lords, who incidentally controlled the Parliament of Ireland. The majority of the members of that Parliament were controlled by the big landowners in England, many of whom had never set foot in Ireland and didn't even know what was going on. They were, driven by, sheer rapacity. Yes, there was a lot of hostility, religious hostility towards the popery or the Roman Catholic Church, which to a certain extent even, culturally still exists to this day. But the Catholicity of these people was just an excuse for those land-hungry, big-time property owners in Britain to gather more, so that John could tell Tim that he owns an extra 5,000 acres, whatever it may be. And it bears repeating that the English owners of large tracts of land had almost no contacts with the land apart from collecting profits, getting remittances from their land agents. They didn't know what was going on. They got reports, which are just devastating, from English travelers, who wrote up what they observed. And it was horrifying to read some of this stuff. But it just went over their head. I mean, it was, it's see no evil, hear no evil, feel no evil. And I think to a certain extent the large English landowners and the Anglo-Irish had convinced themselves that Irish Catholics were maybe barbarians or something less than human. There had always been this notion that the Irish were barbarians, and they had to be put down once and for all. And it's in the early years, it's true that within Ireland they were constantly battling each other, different warlords or different kings of different counties, which made it very difficult for the crown to maintain any kind of control. But after Henry VIII, and as a result of actually, a couple of large-scale killings by Irish Catholics. I mean, they weren't exactly totally without fault in this whole scheme of things, but nothing in comparison to what they reaped in reprisals. they just had convinced themselves that these were a subhuman class of people. It's really quite amazing. They really were, by and large, ethnically not much different than the people around them. But they had been, the English Civil Wars, Cromwell, the transplantation of Ulster, and other areas had just fed into this notion that these were barbarian people and they just deserved it. So by 1730, like I say, the enforcement of the worst penal laws against the Catholic Church and against priests, which involved some horrifying experiences of people being publicly whipped and dragged, and raids against Catholic services. They found out one way or another where there was going to be a mass said, and crowds with pitchforks and whips would attack. But like I said before, the laws against the Catholic Church began to ameliorate, while there were periodic uprisings by Irish Catholics, there were also some instances in which the Irish Catholics joined forces with the Anglo-Irish, the Protestant property owners, where they had interests in common. It was a volunteer movement mid-century. So, and this is to become a theme. By the end of the 1700s, there was a very strong Irish independence movement, spearheaded primarily by Protestants, Anglo-English Protestants. In any event, the full emancipation, there were Irish Relief Acts, and I think 1774, and a big one in 1793, specific acts for the relief of Catholics, in which anti-Catholic laws were abrogated, and the requirement of taking the oath in which they repudiate basic beliefs in Catholicism was abrogated. Full emancipation for the Catholics of Ireland didn't come until, I think it was 1826. But the impact of the penal laws was felt for generations, I think down even into the 20th century. It contributed materially, together with the poor economy and the overpopulation, which was actually stunning, how quickly the population of Ireland rebounded from these horrible experiences. By 1840, by the time of the Irish potato famine, there were 8 million people living in Ireland, which up from probably 4 million, 3.5 million maybe at the beginning of the 1700s. So they were, I don't know how to explain, except that they had large families and they produced large families, and there was absolutely nothing to do, probably, but procreate. But I should say that during this time, they were not successful in suppressing and destroying, what was, a thriving culture or subculture. There was, these people were very good at entertaining themselves. They had some talented minstrels that traveled. They were very good at retelling poetry and epic poems that they had memorized, going back, 800 years. Storytelling, music, dancing. And that's probably what kept them going through these periods of really great pestilence for them. There was also a very terrible famine in the mid-1700s, which actually caused a big dip in the population. Not as bad as the Cromwell destruction, but still, looking back with what historical records we have, was significant. So the full impact of the penal laws was to really leave these people in a terrible, precarious situation in terms of education, social skills. When the famine hit in the late 1840s, And that takes us to 1848, when on my mother's side, my maternal great-grandparents came in 1848, as did the ancestors of many people in this room here today. It was a mass death and a mass migration to the United States, especially to England, the United States, to Canada, Australia, and it impacted very much how the Irish were seen in this country, because until that point, the Irish who came tended to have paid their own way. They tended to be artisans, craftsmen, whether they were Catholic or non-Catholic. My great-great-grandfather was a shoemaker. He probably paid his own way. And he was from the north, from Fermanagh, where the McMorrows come from. And at the time that he came, there was really no great anti-Irish sentiment. In about 1700, the crown, the English crown, got the Parliament to pass a law suppressing the manufacturing of woolens in Ireland, which was devastating. That really was the act which resulted in so many of the Protestant Irish in the north of Ireland, coming to the United States. Overnight, there was just a huge community that was out of work. And so many of the Scots-Irish, as we know them, people who had been transplanted to Ireland, up and came to the United States and Canada. And that's the origin of so many of them. So, but about 50 years ago, after I graduated from law school, but before I reported for active duty to the Army, I had picked up a commission through ROTC and had a reporting date. I went back to Ireland. I had been there before. And I went to the county where my great-grandparents had come from. And I say great-grandparents, it was a long time ago, but in my family there are a couple generations missing because, like the Irish, they married so late. My grandfather married at the age of 45. He married a woman who was 24 years younger than him. Then he went on to have 6 kids. So there's whole generations missing in there. But I ended up visiting this farmer down in the very area where the family came from, and I knew where that was, with the name Cagney. And I had been raised with my grandfather because it was a farm that I spent my summers at. I was 12 years old when he died, and I always heard him talk about the planters that took the Cagney land, and he knew the name of the family, Wilkinson. It was kind of amazing. So I ended up sitting around this table of a farmer that I had met in a very prosperous farm. He had a couple hundred acres, all new John Deere equipment, beautiful land, grazing animals, and and he had a very nice family. And I said, "Boy, you've really done well for yourself." He said, he was aware that there was a tradition within the family of a time when they owned their own land and when there were professions, when there were artisans and there were barristers, there were lawyers and teachers, the same things that they are actually in the United States now. And he said, I'm aware of that, and he said, and I'm aware of what I've been able to achieve, and my father, and through a lot of sacrifices, we're back to where, we have a good life now, he said, but he said, I'm always just periodically tempted to think, what would have been if the society and the culture hadn't been so severely repressed and almost destroyed during those years of the penal laws and the great poverty that followed it. He said, it's just hard not to believe that, maybe we in Ireland might have had, a period of ascendancy, like the Protestants of the 18th century did here. Our day may have come. So I thought about that again when I was dug out my great-grandfather's mortgage that he filled out to buy some additional land. They came in 1848 to suburban Boston, and they were illiterate. And they started out as chimney sweeps, and they became experts in repairing furnaces and building furnaces. They saved $2,000, and my great-grandmother sewed it in her skirt. And they took the train to White Pigeon, Michigan, and then they took the stagecoach to Kalamazoo, and they bought a 40-acre parcel in Pavilion Township. And then in 1876, I found the mortgage that they gave to build, to buy another 85 acres. And I found it interesting because I had never paid that much attention to it. But there's an X there. He was illiterate. He was illiterate when he came to this country, and I guess he just never felt comfortable. His children were all literate, of course, but it was a big jump for him. And I think of how hard he worked, and I don't know if many of you remember the Gangs of New York, the scene at the end of the movie. They're looking over Manhattan from the Green Lawn Cemetery. It's the Gangs of New York. The 5 Points was brutal, foul area. And then it's a green lawn where presumably these people they're just relatives are buried, and it's looking over at Manhattan in today's time. And well, my great-grandfather is his stones. The children put up a nice stone for him, and it's the last one on the northwest corner of Riverside Cemetery, so you can't miss it. He was buried in 1905, and every time I turn on that road to go north on Riverview Drive, I just tip my hat to him. He was a tough old bird, and it was a long climb for the family out of that, but climb they did. Questions?
Thank you. Who's got questions here? Anywhere? All set? It's funny you mentioned about the generations because the hell they skipped. My grandmother was born in 1850, married in 1868. My father was born in 1895. I came along in 41. There were about 6 generations normally should be around in that particular time. So that was pretty common. So, and the suppression did not end with the penal laws. You go to that so-called famine. There was a famine you normally think of as no food anywhere in the country. There was a ton load of food in Ireland.
It was a blight.
There was a blight on the potato crop, period. My great-grandfather, one famous thing, took a shipment of their cattle to England at the same time the coffin ships were going to America for the poor, starving people who didn't have anything to eat. They lost their their potatoes, but their oats and everything else had to be given to the landlord to feed the English. So it was a crime that went on there.
One of the penal laws, incidentally, was that you could not send your children abroad to be educated, and that was observed in the breach. Let me tell you, thousands of Irish kids were sent abroad. Some of them very young to be raised by French families. In some cases for movement into the Irish Brigade, or maybe even into the French brigades. There were just a lot of Irish fighting on the continent. There were an amazing number of Irish who rose to field grade leadership. Yeah. Majors, colonels, field marshals, 3-star generals, and they were good enough that they commanded not only the Irish, but the other forces. They were. You find these names in they all the way from Spain to Russia. They were all over the continent. I often wonder how many of them actually came home. They probably just people got assimilated into the Irish culture. They probably got assimilated into the host country culture. They don't get written up that much because the people writing the history of their country do not want to credit other countries. Look at our own writers. Do we really want to credit the people who really won the American independence? It was the French. No. We changed the name to Freedom Fries.
One of the comments I think that went on from the penal laws was how they couldn't get educated. My father said when he was a kid, he heard from the Irish, get an education, because that's the one thing they can't take away from you.
Marie Antoinette had Irish Guards, and they were going to take her away from France and bring her to Ireland. I mean, that fell through. But I do remember that, and of course, Marie Antoinette stayed and eventually lost her head over it.
I find it very interesting that over even the recent centuries, people have done terrible things to other people, you know, and
Still doing it.
in all different parts of the world, you know. So, and we have recent history. We see on the news that the blood is shed in your living room because you watch the television. But what fascinates me is that things that happened centuries ago linger on in the minds of people. These are cultural memories that still divide them. And I found it very interesting. I've traveled around. One of the most interesting things I found was how I took a tour of the Great Wall when I was in Jerusalem along with my wife, and how the lady commentator had complete hatred for the people who came and established the temple on the rock, you know, the mosque on the rock. Now, this was something that happened centuries ago, and the same kinds of problems linger on in other countries. In India, for example, people will give you examples of how the Mughal invaders came in and razed the temples to the ground, and it lingers in people's minds as if it just happened yesterday and continues to divide them. So I don't know if anybody has any comments on this issue, because it seems almost illogical when we live in the modern world and we should learn how to live with each other, and we have moved along, yet memories of 600, 1,000 years ago linger on in our minds and in our culture as if that happened just yesterday.
Yeah, of course, in the defining distinction here between being, you know, Catholic and Anglican or state, you know, the state religion. And, you know, I've thought for a long time, from the first time I went to Ireland in 1962 as a community ambassador. I don't know how many of you here remember the community ambassador program in Kalamazoo.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
recall it.
and in fact, I ran the last community ambassador programs for the Civitan Club. When I came back, I just kind of felt that I owed it to the program.
Mhm.
And then it died a natural death. But I have thought for a long time that the best thing that could happen to Ireland is it could somehow get the yoke of the Catholic Church off its neck. And that's happening.
I just, excuse me, wanted to mention is, even though my name is Reich, my grandmother was in Egan. She was the eldest of 11 children. And they used to have, when I was growing up, the wakes in the living room of their parlor.
Mhm.
And it was, you know, periodically a priest would come, or they'd say prayers, everyone was crying. And then after a certain moment, they put up a screen between the living room and the dining room, and they had one hell of a time drinking, and the men were in the kitchen. And the men were just sitting there, you know, kind of very solemn, but drinking. And I assisted at 2 of those wakes when I was growing up. I don't know whether anybody else had. My family is from Galway, and also came over in, I think, 1847 or something like that.
Galway was one of the western counties, and quite poor. Very, very popular and prosperous now, by the way.
I think your comment about, you know, things that happened hundreds of years ago, what happened in 1695 continued. And even though they got rid of those laws, the suppression continued right up to the 20th century. And the Irish didn't get out of their poverty until basically after World War II, and the tech companies came in. It was still a poor country right up till the 60s. Desperately poor.
I think the big first company that came in was Pfizer.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment about religion, because I certainly agree that, you know, land grabbing was motive for a lot of this, but we need to remember that Cromwell thought of himself as God's messenger to establish a kind of kingdom of God on earth in the Protestant Calvinist tradition, and that and many of his followers were of the same extremely religious mindset, so that these penal laws, I think they would see as nothing less than what the Irish deserved, as the agents of the devil and the Pope, whom Cromwell and his army had just defeated in England by killing Charles I, whom they considered papist. So I think some of the Irish, even today, see that as a fundamentally religious persecution as much as they do a land grab.
The Nazis thought they were justified too.
David, I have a question. Were they called penal laws at the time, or is that something that came up to describe them afterwards, historically?
No, I think they were called penal laws at the time because they were penalizing
So it
the
was-
people.
That was the clear intent, that they were penal laws.
Oh, yes, and yeah, indeed. And when they actually were in the end of the century, when they were abrogated, it was called abrogation of the penal laws too. Yeah, and boy, you should. I mean, I won't take your time to read it now, but the Declaration against the tenets of Catholicism, it's half a page. There was this was written by a skilled lawyer, because there's no way out of this thing without lying. Any other questions, Howard?
I was just, meditating on Edmund Burke's noting a machine of wise and elaborate contrivance, and certainly the penal laws as they evolved, but somewhere along the line, didn't somewhere besides the land grab, and then this was land grab by Protestant English against the papists. But wasn't there also a partial motive that crept in about offering the chance for conversion for Catholics to become Protestants, to join the Church of England, the Church of Ireland, and that this was a temptation for some Catholics. And I know in Spain, the Spanish crown, Ferdinand and Isabella, and then went on to try to eliminate the Muslims and the Jews. Especially the Muslims left, and the Jews were given the choice in 1492 or a little after, convert, become a converso, or leave. And many Jews in Spain stayed and became pretend Catholics, but preserved their Judaism, some of them centuries into some people in New Mexico. 19th, 20th century viewed themselves to really be Spanish Jews, not by ancestry. So within the case of Ireland, was there an alternative to hold on to your land by becoming a Protestant, for Catholics a chance to convert?
Oh yes, yeah. You could, in fact, the same reason that lawyers converted, because they, barristers and solicitors, because they had built a practice, a business, and but so too the large Catholic landowners. Yes, they would convert. Now, it kind of runs against the purpose of the penal laws if they convert. So they were, as I understand it, they were put through, a rigorous cross-examination by the vicars, and by, sometimes the big landowners would have to go before bishops in Dublin, or, they would be cross-examined, and they go through, days, if not weeks, of training in the church. And it had beliefs of the Church of England, and if they did it and they signed the Declaration against Transubstantiation and signed the oath of supremacy to the Queen or the King, whoever it was, then they were really grilled, because if everybody did that, there wouldn't be any land left to take. So Now there were some some Protestants who they'd been raised next to their Catholic neighbors for a long time, and they were friends. And there were cases of Protestants buying land or holding land in their name for the Catholic family, until the time when they thought down the road when they could be able to transfer title. I don't know how extensive that was, but it happened. And I'm sure that the laws against trading or doing business with Protestants, I'm sure they were observed in the breach, because there were Catholic tradesmen, the people had dealt with for years, and they would probably want to continue trading with them.
One of the perversions of your idea about the conversion was during the famine, when the Church of Ireland, otherwise known as the Church of England, had soup kitchens. And they'd be lined up outside to get this weak soup. And when you got up there, they would give you the soup if you converted to the Church of Ireland. And if you didn't get fed.
They became known as supers.
What is the percentage of the Catholic?
It's probably 90% in the Republic of Ireland. Yeah. Maybe it's less than that, because I think that as a result of all the problems and scandals with the Catholic Church, and the abortion issue and others, same-sex marriage, you name it. A lot of people have just said goodbye to they're culturally Catholics. They're like Catholics in this country. They give up their they become. They convert, but they do it in a uniquely Catholic way. You know what I mean? So it's I think it's in Ireland. They were the first country in Europe to elect a gay prime minister. Yeah. They got in a real pissing match, with the Vatican, over what they considered to be deceitful reporting by the Vatican and behavior by the Vatican. And they withdrew their embassy, I believe, and they kicked the papal nuncio out. So
I heard that the church attendance used to be 90%. It's 10% now. That's how bad it's gotten. Or good, depending how you look at it.
When did the doctrine of transubstantiation come in? I thought that was Pope Leo X that did that. And doesn't that come after that?
No, I think doesn't that come in around 1011? The theologians were dealing with that.
Well, but I don't think the term itself, transubstantiation, was there. I'm going to have to look that up, because it did come in as
Well, this
one of the Leos.
Well, the declaration, I do solemnly and sincerely in the presence of God profess, testify, and declare that I do believe that in the sacrament of the Lord's Prayer there is not any transubstantiation of the elements of bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ at or after the consecration thereof by any person whatsoever, and that the invocation or adoration of the Virgin Mary or any other saint and the sacrifice of the Mass as they are now used in the Church of Rome are superstitious and idolatrous. And it goes on from there.
What year was that?
That was probably probably about 1600.
Any other questions? Nope. Apparently. Thank you, Dave, very much for your presentation. Well, thank you all for coming tonight, and I look forward to seeing you next week for Dr. Cagney's talk on the multi-universes, okay? Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. That was great.
Jeff,